warm welcome to everyone. We have Ben and Mike with us. Mike is the Director of Product Management with Becker Professional Education and has extensive experience in public accounting, corporate accounting, and education. He is a licensed CPA in the state of North Carolina. Then we have Ben with us, who is International Managing Director of Becker Professional Education, and he is a CFA, US CPA, Canada CPA, and CGA himself. They'll be taking us through the state board evaluation and assistance, CPA strategy and study tips, approach to MCQs, art of solving simulations, Becker product demonstration. All evaluation questions and process related questions will be addressed in the end by Sripal. Yes, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for the introductions, and thank you, Sripal, in inviting us to organize this event. So we're happy to support him. I understand there's a lot of insights going on, not just in India, but worldwide. I personally experienced it since December, because I look after international business, and China is actually the first one that go through the lockdown. So I can share with you my experience back in December. Basically, what happens is all of a sudden, everything basically fall off the cliff. Not just gradually, but suddenly everything disappeared. Right. So, but basically, look back now, what's going on in China now. People start going back to work. People start going out to the restaurants, basically going back to the normalities. So understand there's a lot of frustrations going on worldwide, not just in India, believe me, in the US and also in Canada as well. But one thing that I want you guys to focus on is, so this thing is going to be over. How soon? Don't know. But what we need to do now is actually focus on what we call our immunities. Immunities in terms of like immunities against disease, or basically improve our health, and also immunities against economic downturns going on as well. So one thing that we know for sure is there will be depressions or recessions coming soon. And how fast the recovery will happen, nobody knows. But basically, because of these downturns, we have to make sure we all prepare, we improve ourselves during these down times. So that's, with that said, I'm glad that you guys are joining us today instead of watching the news again, focusing on the negativities. So with that, I'll pass it on to the Mike and Sripal to talk about the share their view. So enjoy the seminar, enjoy the info sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and I'll add my thanks to Simandhar and Sripal for inviting us to join you this morning. Here, I guess, Sunday evening for you guys, early Sunday morning, even earlier for Ben. So appreciate him getting up with us to introduce. So yeah, these are truly extraordinary times. I can tell you that there are a lot of very, well, I'll put it this way, the CPA exam does create a lot of stress with students around the world. US students certainly no exception, because as you would not be here if you didn't understand the importance of the exam, the importance that the license can make, and the difference it can make in your career. Adding in the uncertainty, the just rapid change that the coronavirus pandemic is bringing is only magnifying, if not multiplying, that stress. And there's a lot of questions. So what we're going to do today, kind of a tag team approach, right? So my expertise as a Becker director and national instructor is the exam itself. So I'm going to take you through information about the exam, a little just touching lightly on exam process, talk a little bit about strategy for the multiple choice and simulations, which are the two main building blocks of the exam. And then talk just briefly about some of the key features of the Becker program. I want to leave as much time as I can, because I know what a lot of your questions are going to relate to is ensuring and kind of the process by which you can take the exam. I know there's a lot of interest right now because the AICPA has decided to pilot testing in India, which is fantastic news. I think that's fantastic, period. Doubly so given the current situation. As well as I know there's a lot of questions. I was able to and had the pleasure to visit India last December, and I understand, how many different variables there are in terms of qualification to sit for the CPA exam. What Sripal and the team has asked, and I'll reiterate, is that if you have questions about eligibility, questions about evaluations, questions about the process, please hold those toward the end. I'm going to turn over the balance of the time to Sripal at the end, and he and his team are really going to be, as I may be what I consider my expertise, the exam itself, they are the undisputed experts in everything about Indian candidacy. And that's why I want to give them all the time I can toward the end to do that. So with that all being said, let's start with the most basic, which is, so what is a CPA exactly anyway? What's unique about it is that although a lot of folks will say, oh, the CPA, so it's just a credential like any other, so like a CFA or a CMA, or the truth is, no, it isn't. It is a license, and that makes it unique. It's unique over here as well because it is granted by one of 55 jurisdictions. That includes the 50 US states, plus Washington, D.C., plus a number of overseas territories like Guam. So it's a governmental licensure, which makes it a bit unique. That's different than, say, the CMA, which is granted by a professional organization, the IMA, as a credential. To get there, to be able to call yourself a CPA, as I do and a number of my colleagues do, you have to make good on the 3 E's. So the 3 E's are education, exam, and experience. Here's where things get complicated. It's almost a bit of a joke. It's called the quote unquote uniform CPA exam. The only thing uniform about it is the exam itself. The test, regardless of what state you're a candidate of. So if you're there and you're saying, yeah, I'm already applied, I'm going to be a candidate under the rules for Alaska or Guam or Washington State. The only thing that's the same, no matter which of those you do, is the test itself. And if you were to sit in India at one of the testing centers there, it would still be the same exam drawn from the same bank of questions. However, where things get complicated is the other 2 E's. So the education requirements vary state by state because they're a fact of state law. The experience requirements vary state by state. And so that's part of what I know Sripal and his team will tackle a bit later, is kind of how to navigate those choppy waters to understand those requirements. But you have to put the 3 E's together. Once you do, then you can apply to become a licensed CPA. And once you are a licensed CPA, that's what entitles you to put those 3 letters after your name. But the question also then has to be asked, great, okay, I get this license, I see it's a challenge, fantastic. What's the benefit exactly? Why would I want to do that? Well, one and probably most important is it has long been called the gold standard. CPA is unique because although it's a US credential, it is recognized worldwide. It's recognized beyond the borders of accounting as well. We joke sometimes over here that if you tell someone who is not in the business world that you're a CPA, they'll immediately ask for your help with their taxes. I then have to warn them that that's not my expertise. Please don't ask me. I worry I do mine wrong. So, but in any case, it's something that folks do recognize. And it's going to open a lot of different doors for you, right? There's a lot of opportunities. One of the other things that students in the last 20 years have really seen change is that a CPA is not just an accountant or an auditor or a tax professional. A CPA is a business advisor. A CPA has a range of skills, which is why not only do you find them now in accounting firms, corporations, large publicly traded companies, governmental organizations, in education, you name it. And it's partly because being a CPA demonstrates a broad range of knowledge. Why else is there opportunity here? Well, one is, although accounting is as popular as it has ever been, it's not enough, right? At the end of the day, we need a supply of accountants. And as many are entering the profession, we're losing more. As the baby boomers retire out of the workforce, we're losing more. So that means obviously the supply is going down effectively. Basic economics tells us that's a good thing if demand is increasing or even steady. Adding to this is the fact the AICPA has had a focus on establishing reciprocity with a number of international bodies so that your US CPA will be directly recognized by bodies such as Canada, Scotland, and Hong Kong, among others. And this is part of kind of the AICPA's global strategy that you see at work. At the end of the day, there are 4 primary organizations, and I have been talking about these 4 organizations more than usual because each of them has had to weigh in during this coronavirus crisis in terms of what they're going to do to address their candidates. The first of these is the AICPA. Think of these, the AICPA, think of them as they write the exam. That's their job. So they're focused on the content. They decide what is testable on the exam, what's within the scope of the exam. In terms of its day job, it is the professional organization that represents all of us as CPAs and all the various things that means. The second, I already talked about, the state boards of accountancy. So they set the law, they determine who can or is eligible to be licensed. They also have a number of regulatory responsibilities. If a CPA breaks the rules, violates a law, anything like that, ultimately the state board is the body that can then take action, can suspend a license, can even rescind a license if that's appropriate, or level other disciplinary action. And then we have NASBA. So if you take all those 50 plus state boards and other boards of accountancy and put them together, you get NASBA, which is the association representing all of those state boards of accountancy. Their job is to deal with all the paperwork, right? So when you talk about, well, who exactly is managing issuing the documentation that lets me go take my exam, and who's the body that sends me my scores when they're released? And that's NASBA. That's their job. They're the ones that are maintaining the database of candidates. It's also, again, day job. Is there a forum, right? So as an association, they're there to help all the state boards address the issues they're facing. And then we've got one more player that usually is not as critical, but has become a lot more so, and that's Prometric, because Prometric runs the centers where the exam, being a computer-based exam, is actually given. In the US, they've been shut down since the 3rd week of March, which normally students would have been eligible to start taking the CPA exam again in April, right? So we have a system of testing windows, which I'll talk about in a bit. But basically, there are a lot of candidates who were planning to sit in the last, say, 3-4 weeks and haven't been able to, simply because the testing centers have been closed. That's going to continue. In fact, that's been a fluid situation. I can tell you, just for the frustration of US candidates, in the span of 24 hours, they got the message that, well, sorry, the Prometric centers are going to be closed through the end of May. Then a day later, they were told, well, but they're open for essential fields, and yes, accounting's one of those, so you can take the test in May. And then there was but individual testing centers might still be closed anyway. So it's been mass confusion. I think you can understand each one of these groups is trying to figure out what to do and how they can do it, but none of them can act unilaterally, right? Even if the state boards all said, we want people to be able to test in May, Prometric can say, no, we don't think that's safe and we're not going to do that. So that's part of the challenge here. But those are the key players, and they're going to keep being the key players as we move forward. So I talked about the 3 E's. What are all the main steps? Well, the first one is you have to make sure you've met all the requirements to sit for the exam. And although that's step 1, that's the one I'm largely going to dodge, because that's the part that our friends from Simandhar really are the experts to help you understand, am I qualified? If not, how do I get qualified? What's the gap? What am I missing in order to then submit a successful application? Step 2 is you then send in all the required paperwork, documentation, online application to whatever state or jurisdiction you're applying to. Step 3 is, while that's being processed, because that can take a number of weeks, especially given things right now, I'm sure at best it's going to be as slow or slower than usual, but that's a great time to start studying, is to start your preparation. Then you get back what's called an NTS. The NTS, or Notice to Schedule, is the formal document issued by NASBA that allows you to schedule your exam. Then you can go and schedule it. And then finally, you sit, you pass, and you put all 3 E's together ultimately to become a CPA. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but what I do want to kind of deliver here is the idea that, as I said earlier, although this is the uniform CPA exam, there's nothing uniform about the requirements. And here are 3 that we know to be common targets, or at least common choices for Indian candidates, and I would say more generally a lot of international candidates. But you can see that the requirements in terms of, well, how many credit hours or equivalent credit hours do I need? Do I have to have graduated before I can apply? How many courses in accounting or business or other you can see just with these 3, and frankly, I could have picked just about any 3 jurisdictions in the United States, and you'd see the same thing. You'd see every state has slight differences. And that's one of the things it pays to have someone who can help you make sense of all that. And that's where and that's part of why Becker doesn't do this directly. By and large, we work with international partners because we know they're the experts. And that's why we work with Simandhar in India, because we know they're the experts. They know 10 times what I do, certainly, maybe more, about exactly how an Indian degree or from a particular university lines up with particular state requirements and can make intelligent recommendations to you about the best way forward. So this is where I get to duck and avoid this question. But I will tell you this, you're not alone, because hands down, if I were giving this presentation to any group in the United States, most of the questions would come from this very same slide, because US students face a version of the same things you do. They're unsure whether their university transcript, whether their educational background will meet a particular state's requirements and what state to choose in some cases. So you're not alone. This is very common. I just think there's an extra degree of challenge that being an international candidate brings to the table. But let's get away from the process. Let me talk about the thing that I know the best, which is the exam itself. And we'll start with some basic highlights. And you might say, boy, Mike, you didn't do a particularly great job of editing here. You got red. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to highlight some of the most recent changes to the exam. So generally speaking, number 1, it is a computer-based exam. It's given at testing centers, right? It's completely computerized. It's an on-demand exam, meaning you have the control over at least when you select to sit. Now, you're bound in by when those centers are available for you, but you do get the choice, so that does make it on demand. The exam works in testing windows, calendar quarters. Now, the reason windows are important is that red part. So historically, and if you talk to anyone who has sat for the exam in the last, 15 years, frankly, they would tell you, oh, yeah, there are these windows where you can take the test, and then there are periods where you can't. Currently, the way it works, and the way it worked before we shut down, so let's say first quarter of this year, the exam is given in the first month and the second month in its entirety, so January, February, and then the first 10 days of March. Here's where things get a little interesting. Before coronavirus reared its head, the AICPA was already moving toward what they're calling continuous testing, which is they wanted to get away from this whole dark period of 20 or so days where the test wasn't given. They're moving forward with that. So at least from a US testing center and a US perspective, they're going to start offering the test year-round, which is great, gives more flexibility. The other thing that complicates this is we understand it, and what AICPA has said is that since they're going to be doing this pilot in India, they're going to be opening those testing centers in India for CPA exams specifically during the months of June and September. We'll see if that perpetuates beyond that time, but at least it's a unique opportunity for all of you that they're doing that. And I think they're very bluntly doing that, not just because it's something they've wanted to do in India, because I know they have. It's because it is incredibly difficult and highly uncertain whether you could travel to any of the US territories you would need to go to sit the exam. And the AICPA doesn't want to cut off a whole wonderful pool of candidates just because you can't travel. So those were all the things driving this. But that was the decision made. Now, if you were still coming to the US, what you'd be hearing is once the Prometric Centers open, whenever that may exactly be, testing is basically going to be year-round from that point forward, because the examiner said, look, we're going to start continuous testing in July, but by the way, given everything happening, we're going to go ahead and make an emergency provision to open all of June anyway. So basically, once a Prometric Center reopens, it's open for good in terms of testing, which is great. At the end of the day, the CPA exam has two types of questions, basically. Multiple choice, what we call MCQs, and task-based simulations, which is mentioned here. It could be short questions, case studies, research, can be written communication on the business section of the exam. It is all computer graded in its entirety. That even includes the written communication. So some students, and particularly students where English may not be your first language, say, oh, I'm a little worried about that written communication. Don't be. It's graded by computer, which means it's very much about building an answer designed to garner points. The magic number is 75, and it's a little misleading to say 75%, because that implies, oh, I have to get 3/4 of the questions correct, and according to this, you can do that with the mix of questions, half of your score is coming from those multiple choice, half from those simulations. It's not quite true, because it is a scaled score, meaning they can weight questions differently. So you could potentially get, let's say, 64% of the questions right, but that may convert to a 77. We don't know, because that can change exam by exam, window by window. I'll show you the pass rates, which kind of demonstrates that the fluid nature of that. But the number to keep in mind is 75. It has been 75 since I took my exam, since long before I took my exam. It still is today, and I don't see that changing in the future. If you passed, awesome. There are 4 of these, right? 4 sections of the CPA exam. Pass 1, great. You now have 18 months to pass the other 3. If you don't, that specific score expires. A couple things I'm often asked. Mike, does it run from the date I get my score back? No. It ran from the day 1 of that 18-month clock is the date you sat. You don't know you've passed until you get your score, but that was the day you actually did pass the exam. 18 months starts from there. Another question is, oh, so after 18 months, I lose everything. No. As you pass each part of the exam, each part has its own 18-month countdown. But the game here is you do not want to get into the trap of losing scores. So that's why we tell our candidates all the time is that, yeah, you have 18 months, but the real game here is try to sit for all 4 parts as efficiently as you can so that you give yourself the largest margin of error should you need to retake 1 or more parts to make sure you can get all 4 in within the 18 months. And then the last thing that also changes with continuous testing, although it won't necessarily benefit y'all in India per se, but as they've gone to continuous testing, they're going to do away with one other problem, I think, which was if you sat for an exam, you couldn't try it again until a new quarter. So here's the problem. Let's say I took the exam on January 2nd, and I got my score back on January 20th, let's say, and I found out I failed. I got a 74, just barely failed. And I say, oh, man, this is all very fresh in my mind. I want to go ahead and retake. You couldn't. You had to wait until April because you had to wait till a new quarter. Well, with continuous testing, they're doing away with that rule as well. So under the new system, if I got my score back January 20th, I could say, oh, no good, get a new NTS and sit as soon as I have that new NTS issued. So it's giving candidates just a little bit more of an option, a little bit more flexibility, which I think is fantastic to be able to basically be able to manage their schedule and so forth. Okay, I'm going to pause there for just a moment. I see I'm just checking. Yep, we've gotten a number of questions coming in, a lot of them related to process. So I'll just reiterate if you were a little late joining us, we're going to tackle those toward the end. All right. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of data here. Let me boil it down. There are 4 sections. They are each 4 hours. So the easiest way to remember the basic structure of the CPA exam is 4 by 4. 4 parts, 4 hours each. They're made up of multiple choice questions and TBSs. That varies slightly. The way I explain to candidates is 60, 70, somewhere between 60 and 80 multiple choice, very slightly. somewhere around 7 to 8 simulations, broken up into 5 separate what they call testlets. And the only thing you need to know about a testlet is it's like sitting for 5 short exams in a row, as if you were sitting at a university or other standardized test, and you had to turn it in. So basically, if we look at the very one at the top there is audit, first thing you get is a batch of 36 multiple choice. You decide how to manage your time, what order to work those questions in. When you're satisfied, you electronically submit that first testlet to receive the second. Do the same, turn in number 2 to get number 3. Once you turn one in, once you submit it, you can't go back. And then you move your way through all 5. The 4-hour clock starts with question 1, testlet 1, and it does not stop until you either get through the last testlet and you submit it, or the clock runs out. A couple other times to keep in mind. Now, I tried to update this chart a little bit because I said, how do I convey the 2 special windows for India and the fact that we're also going to continuous testing here in the US? So the blue represents the current state, right? And that was the case through Q1, January, February. We're now in this weird Q2 where testing centers are shut down. But if you're a US candidate, June's open, right, or will be. If you're an Indian candidate, June's when they plan to be one of the 2 months of the pilot. The other thing to bear in mind is not only that 18-month clock, but the NTS itself. So when you apply, you get that NTS, that's what enables you to schedule your exam. That NTS is typically good for 6 months. There are a handful of states that are different. It can be 9 or 12 in select circumstances, but most are 6. That NTS is basically says, okay, great, you're qualified. You can go take the exam. Here's your code. You have 6 months to schedule it. You have to schedule your exam by this date, and it specifies that on the NTS. So when you're applying, that's part of what you're doing is deciding, okay, when do I intend to sit for these various exams? I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of each part. There is a lot of information on these slides. The good news is, if you would like to read more about the exam in detail, particularly if you wanted to ask me any question that started with, how do you know that X is tested on the CPA exam? The answer is, it's in the blueprint. So one of the changes the AICPA made back in 2017 is to be a bit more transparent about what's on the exam, and just as importantly, at what level of understanding they expect you to know it. So the blueprint is publicly available. You, any candidate worldwide, can go to AICPA.org, go to the CPA exam question, and download a copy of the blueprints. It's about 100 pages long, but it does. It provides that a lot of the same information you see on this slide is part of the introduction for each of the 4 sections of the exam. So we decided, how do we boil it down to what we think is most critical to understand? The first is that big, ugly number in the center of the screen toward the bottom, expected study time. This can vary, as you might expect. If I were talking to a student who said, I love auditing, I don't know what about it, I've always enjoyed doing it, I love taking those classes in school, it always made perfect sense to me, I might say you're probably going to be down at the low end of that scale, maybe even below 80 if you're that sharp with audit. Whereas then if you ask me, Mike, how do you feel about regulation? I go, yeah, tax and law have never been my good subjects. I've always struggled with them. So that's where you might say someone who says, yeah, audit never clicked for me. I kind of get it, but not really. If you feel like that's your struggle, then expect that you're going to be on the high end of that. The key thing to take away from this is preparing for the CPA exam is an investment. It's an investment of your time. It's the most precious resource you have. And we're big believers at Becker. Do it right the first time. There's a joke that says there's only one thing worse than having to sit for the CPA exam, and that's having to sit for it twice. So you want to go ahead and say, yeah, this is about me investing this study time to most effectively prepare for the exam. All right, what about that chart over on the right-hand side? Big takeaway here. The examiners have established there are 4 levels of skill that they expect you to be able to demonstrate certain knowledge. The most basic is what they call remembering and understanding. It's effectively what's the rule, right? I like to use financial accounting because that's a more kind of a universal language when I'm talking to an audience. So I'd say if they were asking you what are the criteria for capitalizing a lease, or I don't know, recognizing the allowance for bad debts, and they were just, what are the rules, what are the steps? Basically, do you understand the core? That's that. One step above, that's application. If remembering and understanding is which of the following, A, B, C, or D, is one of the qualifications for capitalizing a lease, or whatever it may be, application then would say, based on this fact pattern, can you prepare the journal entry to record it? Now you're applying what knowledge you understand. Go a step beyond that, you get to analysis. Your client has already prepared the journal entries for their leases. Review them, determine if they're correct, and if not, propose an adjustment. Right now, you have to know what the rules are. You have to know what the journal entry should have been, application, and you have to be able to analyze whether they did it right. And then the highest level is evaluation. Only found on the audit exam, but that kind of makes sense because that's what auditing is. Auditing is performing an analysis on all the different accounts, transaction types, and disclosures for a client, pulling that all together and evaluating, are the financial statements taken as a whole fairly stated in all material respects? It's evaluating all of this analysis. So that's why that appears. It's a narrow piece of the puzzle, and it's only found on auditing. Now you might say, great, how's this help me? It's helpful to understand, and like I said, the blueprint provides transparency. It's really helpful to folks like us in Simandhar, because what the examiners also said is, oh, by the way, if we say something is to be demonstrated, a specific content topic at remembering and understanding, the only way that would show up on the exam is as a multiple choice question. So for us, we say, oh, then we're not going to give you a simulation to test that knowledge. We're going to give you a multiple choice because that's the only way you'd see it on your exam. If it's at that analysis level or evaluation level, that can only be tested with a simulation. Unfortunately, application, which often is the largest section or largest level, can be either. Multiple choice can get there, simulations can start there. So unfortunately there, it's a little bit more of an open end, but at least it gives us some additional insight. On each of the 4 slides for the 4 sections, you're going to see those 3 areas. I'm not going to talk about them from this point on, other than touching on the number of study hours. What I want to focus on for each of the 4 parts then, 4 sections, is what you see at the top left, where it says content covered. The AICPA basically said, we're going to do big chunks. Say, here are the big overarching content areas we expect a candidate to know in this section. So look at Roman numbers 2, 3, and 4. If you have any familiarity with auditing, that should sound pretty familiar because that's an audit engagement, start to finish. Right? Roman 2 says, basically, do you understand your client, their internal control, and the environment in which they operate so that you can make an informed risk assessment, which in turn, that risk assessment should help you develop your audit plan. In Roman 3, you then execute the steps in that plan in order to gather evidence. And in Roman 4, you take that evidence to draw conclusions and ultimately issue the appropriate report. Now, this is called the auditing exam. It's a little bit of a misnomer because the scope of the exam includes auditing, but also includes reviews, compilations, attestation engagements, among others. The last piece is Roman 1. One of the most critical defining characteristics of the accounting profession as a whole and being a US CPA is ethical standards and ethical conduct. Here's what the examiner said. They went, okay, anyone who puts those 3 letters after their name, right? I am a CPA, I am not in public practice, right? I work for Becker. So I am not out there signing audited financial statements. But even so, as a licensed CPA, I am held to ethical standards, and I am held to a portion of the AICPA's Code of Professional Conduct. All CPAs are. That part of ethics is tested on the regulation exam. Now, if I was in public practice, there are additional rules, responsibilities, ethical standards, regulations, you name it, that kick in, right? Not just from the AICPA, but if I'm auditing public clients, now I have to concern myself with the PCAOB and Sarbanes-Oxley. Those specific responsibilities and principles are tested here. So if you add this piece with the ethics piece from regulation, that's the entire scope of ethics on the exam. But I think that says something, that ethics shows up on 2 of 4 parts, how important it is. So for financial, this one is tough because it's kind of vague. Part of the reason being, it's kind of hard to draw bright lines around the content of financial statements. Right? If I said, well, I want to test all the accounts on the balance sheet, kind of hard to do that unless you talk about the transactions that affect them. If I said, let's talk about all the transactions on the income statement, it's a little hard to do that without talking about the related balance sheet accounts. And that's why it's a bit fuzzy. Here's how I like to explain it. Roman 1, about 30%, covers the conceptual framework. Those are the statements of financial accounting concepts, which literally are the framework that governs US GAAP. And financial reporting covers the core financial statements. Romans 2 and 3 roughly align to the balance sheet and the income statement. It's not exact. If you looked at the blueprint, you'd understand what I mean. But if you put 1, 2, and 3 together, which is roughly 90%, that is US GAAP accrual basis accounting, start to finish. Then there's Roman 4, governmental accounting. And specifically, that's focusing in a lot of times on state and local governmental accounting. For example, if we had I live in North Carolina, right? So here we are, we're on lockdown here in Raleigh, which is the state capital. I think I remember when I gave my first presentation in Hyderabad, I said, oh, we have something in common. I believe I'm sitting in the capital of this state, and I'm from the capital of my state. So that's Raleigh. Well, the city of Raleigh has a government, and it has accounting. The state of North Carolina also does, and so on. This is another area that a lot of international candidates go, I've had no exposure to this, right? Why would my university cover United States governmental accounting? Don't feel too bad. Plenty of US candidates don't get exposed to it either. This is one area. There are a couple in the exam. Our job is to review, right? So we're assuming by necessity that you're coming in with a lot of the core knowledge you need to pass this test. Our job, and Simandhar's job, is to help you sift back through all that volume of information and hone it for the exam. But we know there are a couple of areas that you very likely haven't been exposed to before. So we kind of do a crash course to give you enough knowledge to be functional. The good news is, you'll notice governmental is only about 10%. So it's not a huge piece, but part of it's because governmental is, well, with all respect to governmental accountants, it's weird. It does not follow the accrual basis. It has its own strange flavor called the modified accrual basis. It is weird. I think the interesting thing is that for our instructors, what we find is people who like financial accounting don't like governmental. True. There's also the reverse. I know one of my colleagues who I've worked with for, gosh, nearly a decade now. She loves governmental accounting, but doesn't teach the rest of financial because she doesn't like it. To each their own, I suppose. The last thing I'll point out is the number of hours. Financial, in terms of just pure volume of information, it's the fattest. So it takes the greatest overall investment of time. Then there's business, on par with audit in terms of invested time. But this part often gets some funny looks because they go,
sorry to interrupt in between, sir.
Yeah, sure.
So we have few questions from students, sir. It would be great if you can answer that.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Let's pause here. That's absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah, sir. Like we have a first question, like from the previous slide.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm gonna. Yep.
What is the Yes, sir. What is the difference between US GAAP and Indian accounting, sir?
Yeah, there's I can make that question even more complicated. So there's US GAAP, then there's IFRS, right, which is International Financial Reporting Standards, which is what's recognized in a number of the countries of the EU, in fact, a number of countries around the world. And then there's country-specific GAAP, and India is one of those that has largely adopted international financial reporting standards, but not in their entirety. So US GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, are governed by the Financial Accounting Standards Board of the United States. So they're our rules. Now, the good news is big ways, say 90+% of how we account for things in the United States and how IFRS accounts for things and how Indian GAAP accounts for things are identical or very, very close. In fact, what you'll find is, and what a lot of international candidates tell us is, it's not a big jump if they are well educated in their local country GAAP or in IFRS. US isn't different enough to make it really that challenging. I pointed out one big difference is governmental because that's very unique because it's US governmental accounting. That changes a bit when we talk about regulation. I'll go ahead and sneak over here just as a for instance. So regulation is focused on tax. This is an area that a lot of international candidates say they struggle with because it is uniquely United States, and United States tax law has has very little resemblance to anything else. So that can be challenging because even if you've been, taken a number of tax courses, if they're based on, Indian tax law, that can be substantially different. So it really can be tough. And that's where I tell a lot of international students, even if you like tax, you may find yourself having to invest a bit more time here just because you're having to learn the US laws that you may not have been exposed to previously. The same is true here because this is also where business law is tested. That too is US specific. We even find that there can be terminology. There's unique vocabulary found in US law that can be challenging if you've never heard it before as an international candidate. So that's where I think regulation makes that one of the 4 parts the most challenging because it is the most different. International auditing is very, very close to US auditing. International financial accounting, relatively close to US. Business, which we'll come back to in a moment, is universal. It's not country specific at all. So that one is really not going to be any different from what you've seen in school.
Yes, sir. We have a next, shall I move to the next question?
Yes, please.
18-month window starts from which month?
So it starts whenever you sat for the exam. One of the odd things here is it's great that it's on demand, but that means if I was talking to 30 of you and you said, we're all going to take the exam in June, you could all take it on different days, theoretically. And each of you, whatever date you sat, that's when your 18 months starts, right? So let's say, just as for example, today is April 26th. Let's say I was able to take the exam today and I passed. I found out a few weeks later I passed the exam. Awesome. My clock starts and runs from 18 months from today. And so I have until, what would that be, roughly October of 2021, like around October 26th, to pass the other 3 parts. If I don't do that by that October 26th, my part, whatever part that was, expires. Now, if I took, let's say that was financial. Let's say I took auditing in July and I passed that one. I took it July 5th. Then that has its own clock, and that one would expire in January of 2022. So it's 18 months specifically for you from the date you take that part. So it differs person to person to person. But when you get your score, it will specify that, right? It would say you passed, your score is valid until such and such a date.
We have our next question as, does Becker incorporate all new AICPA questions? And what about 2019 questions if 2020 is there?
Yes. So the short answer is absolutely yes. So in a normal year, as a review course provider, so we have a bank of questions that we license from the AICPA. All review course providers do. And with that, each year, you're exactly right, the AICPA will release additional questions, both multiple choice and task-based simulations. When they do, we do that in 2 phases. The moment we get them and can convert them into a PDF, we put them in our course because we don't want to wait. But when the AICPA gives us those questions, they don't explain the answers. They'll tell us, here's the question, the answer is C. So then our curriculum team goes to work to write explanations for why it's C or how to reach the answer C. And the minute we have that done, we then incorporate that into the course. This was a unique year in 2019 because the AICPA actually did a second public release of questions for everyone's benefit. Same way, the minute we got our hands on them, we put them in the course, and as quickly as we could add them into our software, we did so, and we'll update that. Going along with that is not just what the examiners release, but as was pointed out, new standards. So unlike a textbook, we can't be that slow. Textbooks can lag as much as a year, 2 years, maybe more, behind more recent pronouncements. Can't do that. For the CPA exam, once, generally speaking, when a pronouncement comes into effect, is issued, or its effective date, you've got about 6 months, give or take, before it becomes testable. So we can't wait. Once we know something's coming, because usually we have more warning than that, at least we know what's over the horizon. same thing. Our curriculum team will begin working on edits as necessary. And when that new content becomes testable, we will push changes to our course, right? Including our textbooks. And if it affects any specific questions, multiple choice simulations, we'll rewrite those as well. If there's other video content associated with it, we'll re-record that. We are constantly keeping a wary eye on what exactly is likely to change. Sometimes we start preparing and then those changes get delayed. Okay, but at least we've written the new content. We'll keep updating that as necessary until it does go into effect.
Yes, sir. May I move to the next question, sir?
Please do.
When is the next Becker update scheduled for all 4 subjects? Is the update major?
This is the most popular
question. The answer is we don't know, and I'll tell you why. So we do know that our next scheduled update is June. Generally speaking, Becker does 2 major, at least we take the opportunity to do 2 major updates a year, June and December, generally. That's typically because new stuff goes into effect on the exam most often, either on July 1st or January 1st. So that's why we tend to push our most significant updates in June and December. So we'll be making one in June, around June 10th or so. We will push an update. And typically when we do that, we have to then offer, and one of the things we'll be doing with continuous testing is we will, for a period of overlap, right? Because think of it this way. If we push an update on June 10, you might be sitting in late June and go, well, wait a minute, that new stuff isn't testable for me. So we'll actually allow you to use both versions of the course while we have that overlap. But I know for sure regulation will be updated in June. That's typical because a number of the kind of standard tax numbers change every single year in the US. So that's why we're constantly updating those for June. I think there's some minor changes. So one of the things that's a little tricky is that sometimes you have sweeping changes, big enough where we're largely rewriting a whole textbook and a lot of it. A good example of that was when the United States passed what we call the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That required a massive rewrite of regulation. More common are small things. So if a new pronouncement affects 1 unit or 1 lecture or 1 short section, we will update that, but then we will provide that in a number of ways to you. Say, hey, if you want to buy a brand new book, you can do that. If you just want to download the new pages and stick those in your book, you can do that. If you wanted to study with your ebook, the ebook will be automatically updated. You can do that. We also publish documents whenever we make an update. We publish a document that summarizes exactly what pages were changed and why. So a lot of our students take different approaches based on what they want to do. Now, sometimes if we say the changes are massive, which is not that common, we say, you know, you might want to buy a new book just because there's so many changes, like when regulation went through that. We do have a pretty significant one for audit that looks to be December. Now, the reason I can't say with certainty is coronavirus. Because of all this, the AICPA or the FASB could delay implementation of any new rule, which affects when it's testable. Plus, the examiners could say, you know what, with everything else going on, we're going to push back when this is testable. They can do that. And we just have, we as a review course author, we have to be flexible, right? So if the AICPA decides late in the game to change something or may decide, we're going to push that back for 6 months, then we have to adapt quickly and make sure you guys know that. And that's part of what Becker prides itself on, is we want to be right on make sure we're current, always current. And we make sure as we learn things, we funnel that out to our partners like Simandhar. We'll say, hey, here's what we're hearing from the AICPA. Heads up, this is what your candidates need to know.
Our next question is, what are some of the US tax changes and their application?
Ugh. Did I mention I don't like tax? Most of the tax changes, from what I'm told, and this is where I'm a little bit out of school here because there's one section of the exam I don't teach for Becker. This one, the one on screen right now, regulation, because tax has never been my best subject. I'll just leave it there. My understanding is there are not significant changes outside of the standard deduction. So a lot of US tax law says, oh, you're filing as an individual. okay, then your standard deduction amount this year is $3,000, and next year it'll be $3,200, and the year after that's $3,500. So we update our book to account for those, monetary changes. So we do rewrite for that. That doesn't change the substance of the tax rules and how taxes work very much. And that, my understanding is, most of what we're going to see this June is not. I think part of this too is because whenever you see, generally, when you see a major change, which, as I mentioned, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a major change, and that became testable. Should I do my dates right here? I think that became testable January 1st of 2019. Once there's a massive change, you don't tend to see another one for at least a little while. By extension, the other question I'm sometimes asked is, when's the next big change to the CPA exam as a whole? They're looking, but nothing specific has been laid out. One other nice thing, though, is if you want to get information, because we, as I said, we have to reflect the current state of the exam. So the other resource you can go to is the AICPA. Well, whenever they decide they're going to change what's testable on the exam, they update the blueprint and they'll publish it in advance. And they summarize what's changing. So that's another place you'd go, is the AICPA's website. Right now, there is no published blueprint other than the one that's currently in effect. But we've heard probably somewhere during 2020, they will publish an update. The minute that comes out, we start moving. We start updating our materials, making changes as appropriate, so that when that new blueprint goes into effect, we're ready to make the exact same changes in our program, our software, and our content.
Shall I move further?
Go for it.
Indian students now are studying Indian audit standards, which are substantially close to IFRS and US GAAP, except for a few carve-outs or carve-ins. But are these similarities in audit standards worldwide too?
I would say yes, generally. In fact, my sense has been that, I'll put it this way. I have not heard, when I've talked to international candidates, when I talk to folks who have, been educated internationally and have basically kind of been brought up in IFRS or international audit standards or, a specific country, I don't hear, in fact, I can't say I've ever heard anyone say, wow, auditing was a struggle because it was different, because it's not. In fact, the examiners don't even focus that much on what differences there are, because they are so minor, by and large. Occasionally I hear financial, but those tend to be readily identifiable. And what helps here is, within the scope of the exam are significant differences. So if there is a significant difference between a rule, a particular piece of accounting that's important, US GAAP versus IFRS, that actually is testable, and that's called out in our text. So at least you'll get that warning to say, okay, this is a major difference between the two standard sets you should be aware of. But I don't hear that very much with auditing, and I think it's because conceptually auditing isn't all that different. Probably the only differences that are relevant is maybe the standard wording or the exact verbiage you find in the standard audit report or the like might be a little different, but a lot of students, even US students, are learning that for the first time too, right? They're basically kind of having to study the nitty-gritty details of the reporting. So that's why it doesn't, I don't think, tend to be as big a struggle. I reiterate, regulation tends to be the one that causes the most trouble because it is so different. It is in fact, a completely new set of rules that you basically have to learn.
Yes, sir. What does the MCQ number indicates, which is written on top of any MCQ? Does it have any relation with AICPA released questions?
That's a Becker specific question. Yeah, so we do. We assign, that's our number, so no. Although what you can say is that the overwhelming majority of multiple choice questions you find in our software are AICPA release questions, because back before, if I get my dates right here, it was 1991. They actually used to release the exam itself. They released the whole thing, every question, every answer. Now, yes, accounting rules have changed since then, but not always. And we can still adapt old questions because it's a new content. We have to do so that way it's easy to say, oh, that's a question we need to update because of whatever. It's also useful for our students if they have questions, right? it would be kind of a pain for you guys if you're like, oh, I'm looking at this multiple choice. I don't understand this at all. And you feel like, well, so what? Do I have to copy and paste the whole question into an email? How does that work? No, all you have to do is say, I'm looking at CPA dash or MCQ dash 12345. Here's my question, because we can use that same code number to look it up. So our instructors can do that. Our academic support team can do that. So that's the other reason. Yeah, I think memory serves, we do provide some additional information in our software, so you can see on kind of the screen when you're doing multiple choice, it will mention if it was a AICPA released question and when it was released. That data is, we do house that data in our system too. But yeah, it's, as I said, up until 91, the whole exam. Since then, it's been that annual release of a bunch of questions, both MCQs and then later, as they added simulations, have been released as well, which is why we have a fairly robust bank to work with in our course.
Yes, sir. Which two sections have been the most successful out of your experience to be taken first, and then the other two latter?
So for that, I actually have a slide for that. So let me quickly, I've kind of touched on REG, and I know we're going to be running a little short on time. So let me quickly touch BEC. So BEC, or Business Environment and Concepts, is generic, right? I mentioned this one doesn't matter if you're international, US, or otherwise, because it covers things like economics, finance, information systems, ops, cost accounting's in there, managerial accounting's in there, governance is in there. So that's the role of a board of directors and an audit committee and so forth. So it's more general, right? It's general business knowledge. I just wanted to quickly touch on that. But as to your question, I think to do this justice, we also then have to talk about the pass rates. I simplified these. When the AICPA publishes them, they publish it out to 2 decimal places, which would make this a pretty wordy slide. So I've trimmed it down a bit. Here's what you can take from this. I mentioned it's a scaled score, number 1, right? So the pass rates are not vastly different, but they've gotten a little bit more different. If we go back a few years, what you would have found is that the pass rates were much closer part by part. That's not the case anymore. You notice that BEC has climbed to now be about 60%. At the other end of the spectrum is financial, which is averaging at about 46%. That's a pretty big span. It didn't used to be that big of a difference between the quote unquote easiest and hardest exam. So where would I recommend you start? So a lot of our candidates do start with financial. Why? I think because it's seen as being the most challenging. I think that's at least fair in as much as the pass rates are concerned. A lot of students realize I'm going to be the freshest at the start, so why don't I go ahead and knock out the biggest, most voluminous section first? That's fair. A lot of students tell us, well, one section of the exam, I know I was almost constantly taking at least one course in school was financial accounting or some flavor of financial accounting, so it's fresh in their mind. Does that mean everybody does? No, no. There are a lot of different schools of thought here. Some argue I should start with BEC because it's the easiest. That way I get one under my belt. I get used to what it's like going to a testing center and sitting through this exam with content I'm familiar with or comfortable with. Some, by the same extension, would say, oh, I love tax. Tax is my thing. I'm going to start with REG because that's where I'm comfortable. Both have merit. Both arguments do. But you also asked a question about kind of pairing them up. And there is something here I'd like to recommend. A lot of people say that financial and audit have synergy. And there's a good reason for that. Auditing, you're auditing the financial statements of an entity, right? Which means if you don't understand financial accounting, you're going to really struggle with the audit. And that's why we say there's a benefit to doing financial accounting right before, as immediately preceding doing auditing. The other reason is there are actually some simulations that you could see in financial accounting that are readily transferable to audit. For example, financial accounting might say, prepare the journal entry, and you have a simulation that asks you to do that. Auditing might have prepare the adjusting journal entry you come up with. Well, mechanically, that's the same question. It's putting together a journal entry. It's just done through a different context. By the same token, then, if you pair off FAR and OD, people do tend to pair REG and BEC, not so much for any content reason, but the other thing folks do have said to us is makes this a bit more doable is you may have noticed from those slides, Financial and regulation are the two longest in terms of study time. Audit and BEC are short, and a lot of folks tell us it's beneficial to go in an alternating pattern. So do a longer part, then a shorter part, then a longer part, then a shorter part. And so by that standard, FAR followed by audit is a long and a short. Reg followed by BEC is a long and a short. But all that being said, there are other factors. This is where having advisors, having folks who can talk you through your specific situation are beneficial. That's one of the things Simandhar does. We do put some tools in our software as well to help you kind of map this out. But the last thing I'll say is that, sometimes you throw all that out the window. For example, you might say, oh, so you start with FAR no matter what. That sounds like what you're saying, and I think that's a fair argument. But if you'd been asking me this exact same question back in late 2018, I would have said, take reg, because it's about to change. So a lot of times students will flood one part of the exam before a major content change goes into effect. And we say the same, like, oh yeah, try to knock that out so you don't have to know, you have to relearn a whole bunch of new rules. So that too can have an impact in a given time period. So I wanted to add that as well. So it is not an easy question, and there is no one right answer for any specific candidate, because it is a bit based on your expertise, your comfort, your desire. Like I said, some folks want to start with the easy, work their way up. Some folks say, I want to knock out the hard one. I want to knock out the one that scares me first. And there's benefits and logic to both of those arguments.
Are we going to get the desktop app back for Becker?
That's an easy one. No. But yes. So let me explain why I'm sort of couching that one. We did away with the desktop app for a couple of different reasons, but one is that it didn't provide the same quality of experience, in our opinion. It was not as widely adopted either. And to be blunt, it was additionally something we had to support two more platforms, right? Because we had to support a PC-based and a Mac-based. But why would you want it? Well, one of the big reasons is so you could study offline, right? If you don't have a live internet connection, if you're out traveling, whenever we get back to traveling, that's why we do have mobile apps that support a lot of that same functionality. So tablet, phone, what have you, you can, one of the big reasons people like desktop is you could download the content, download the video files, download the questions so you could work offline. Mobile devices, Android and iOS, offer that exact same capability. And that's what a lot of students have told us, is that works as well and has been more widely adopted. We're still looking at ways to continue to enhance how the mobile apps function. But that's part of why I know to some that was disappointing, but that was the decision. And yeah, we don't anticipate bringing that back. Plus, to add to that, some of the newer and I think most exciting course features that are available as you work through the course are internet enabled, meaning you have to have a live connection, so they wouldn't even translate to a offline or desktop application.
Yes. What is the difference between analysis and evaluation?
So as I said, evaluation only appears on auditing. Analysis, here's the way I look at it. Analysis would look at one account or one transaction type, right? So it's you're reviewing your client's inventory, and here are some questions, and it's a simulation that says, here's what your client, this is all their information about their inventory, here's their count, here's this and that, different pieces of information. Now, determine if any adjustments are needed and propose those, right? That's analysis. Evaluation would say, you have found in the course of the audit, you found the following adjustments. Now, assess whether as a whole the financial statements are materially misstated, and discuss or present what kind of report you then issue, right? So it's evaluation. I think of it as sort of analysis plus, because it is still, I feel like it's still analysis type thinking, critical analysis, analytical skills, but it's adding in that ingredient of pulling together multiple different pieces of analysis that you've already done. That only really makes sense in auditing, which is why it's the only part of the exam that you do that, because that is the role of the auditor, right? Ultimately, you have to do a number of different analyses. Each of those renders a conclusion. You then have to somehow synthesize all of that to say, do we give them a clean audit opinion? So that's the difference. Admittedly, evaluation, to be candid, is new, right? The AICPA did not have analysis or evaluation as a skill level before 2017. They didn't have questions. So these were all new questions too. But you may have noticed, if I go back right quick, you'll notice that evaluation is the smallest piece of the pie. It's only 5 to 15%, call it 10. So are you going to see a ton of those? No. And they would only show up as a simulation question because evaluation questions and analysis questions are only there. So I don't think it's that something where you want to be critically worried about it just because it's a pretty small piece of one part of the exam. But yeah, that's how they define it. If you want to read more, that's in the blueprint. They actually go through and give a more robust definition of each of the 4 skill levels.
What makes Becker unique in comparison to other preparation providers? I mean, the competitive advantage that Becker has, which gives an edge to the student who subscribe for Becker. And one more thing, it would be great if we can get a demo of the Becker product, especially the simulations.
Man, I wish I did. I feel like I should disclaim I didn't ask someone to ask that question, but thank you for asking it because you kind of opened the door to the last piece of my presentation. And I do want to leave some time. I know we're running a little long, and I want to make sure I give time to Sripal to talk about the process. But let's talk about Becker. So what makes us different? Well, I'm biased. I've worked for Becker now for over 13 years. But we've been at this a long time. We've been doing this for over 60 years. Over the years, we've had over 1 million candidates. But I think what's really indicative is look to the folks that are employing the largest numbers of accountants. The top 100 accounting firms, not only in the US, but I know a lot of them because I visited them while I was in India, are there, have offices across India as well. Not to mention a number of corporations, universities, governments, and the like, all trust Becker, right? That's one thing. Another is the Watt-Sells Award, and they just, if you're curious, they just released the Watt-Sells. In fact, I think I saw a social media post from Sripal where he was interviewing a Watt-Sells winner from India, which is exciting. But the idea is the Watt-Sells recognizes the very elite scores of the exam. You have to average over 95.5 across all 4 parts. We're talking tens of thousands of candidates annually, maybe 100 plus or minus get this award, but over 90% of them have been Becker students. Now you might say, if they did that well, they probably could have put a Becker book under their pillow and just sort of absorbed it while they slept. But I think when I talk about the Watt-Sells Award, I use it as a great way to distinguish the purpose of a good review course. My suspicion is that the people who won that award might have been able to study on their own and they would have passed. But the whole point of a review course is not to do that. The point of a review course is to, as I said, help you sift through a ton of information, right? A lot of knowledge you need, prioritize it, organize it, hone it to be effective for one specific purpose, passing this test. So you take an average candidate, let's say, and you add in that focus, that honing, and they pass. You give that same focus and honing to someone who already is a pretty strong candidate, and they tend to turn into these Watt-Sells winners. And I think it really drives home what Becker is best at, which is helping you take that knowledge and shape it for maximum effect on the exam. As far as what makes us different or what we feel sets us apart from our competitors, one of them is our what we call personalized learning, and it's powered by Sanalabs. If you want to do a little interesting research, Sanalabs is a Swedish-based company. They're experts in deep learning and artificial intelligence, and we have partnered with them, and part of our course engine is powered by that deep learning mechanism. Long story short, as you work through our course, it's assessing your proficiency across every module in every unit. Then you can do what's called a personalized review session, where the engine will serve up questions to you that it feels are the best to help you improve on your weaker areas, to help build proficiency. There's nothing quite like that in the competitive environment. Now, this is where I get to be a real ham and say, hey, look at that guy. So we have what we call skill master videos. So what we found is multiple choice don't cause a lot of, they generally don't cause a lot of stress. A lot of folks go, yeah, I've done multiple choice. I get it. pick C if I don't know it. But then we talk about simulations, they go, what's a simulation? And it creates angst. Plus, a lot of students told us, look, I worked the question, I read your answer, I understand why the answer is what it is. What I'm struggling with is I wasn't quite sure if I faced off against a simulation like this, I wouldn't know how to get through it efficiently. What's the strategy that goes with it? So we said, okay, we're going to start recording videos. And the idea here is it's meant to feel like a little bit more like YouTube, where as if you're sitting here, if you were sitting in my chair right here working on studying and you said, I'm really lost, and you could turn to me and I'm sitting there next to you and you say, Mike, can you walk me through this? That's what the Skillmaster videos are. None of our competitors have this because every simulation in our main course now, every single one that's over 400 has an accompanying video. And although some of our competitors have what they would call mock or simulated exams, here's why I hold ours as something a bit different. Number one, they're meant to mirror the real thing. One of the things that's so important is that when you walk into Prometric and you sit down at that computer, everything is exactly where you expected it to be. Every button, every font, every color, everything. We want it to be familiar. So our exam software that we use for the simulated exams is as close to a carbon copy as we can get. Tools, everything. So that's number one. Number two, we don't just give you one, we give you three for each section of the exam. So that way you can take one, review results, maybe hone some weaknesses, and then take another one. You can do that 3 times. It's also an opportunity for you to work under the clock, to really test your time management skills on under a 4-hour, and you can actually make this exam real, right? Say, okay, when I'm doing one of these, I need 4 uninterrupted hours. I need to be in a quiet environment, not interrupted. I don't get to have food in the room with me, and I don't have a TV on, or whatever it may be. It's a chance to really simulate what, as closely as you can, we're giving you a tool so that you can make it feel like it's going to feel when you walk into that testing center. Not to mention, it's going to give you some useful feedback to say, where am I still struggling? What should I spend more time on? So these are just a few. Now, you mentioned the demo. Yay. So yeah, there is a place on our site. And what I would do, what I would say is talk to Simandhar first, right? So get their advice, because I think it's important to understand what your process is going to be, and then take a look at the demo. You go to Becker.com and you can pretty easily navigate to it. You can sign up. It's a free demo. It is 14 days now, I believe. I'm kind of doing this looking up and thinking, because we just released an update to how our demo functions. I believe it was released on Friday. That's why I'm double checking, sort of thinking, is this right? Yeah. And I believe it gives you access to the full course environment. It doesn't give you access to all of the units. It's a limited number of units, but otherwise you are in the normal course environment. And that differs. Previously the demo was its kind of own standalone, and it looked a little different. That's not the case, or won't be the case anymore. So it is a chance for you to see all the features I've been talking about here, and others. And we're big believers in that, because we say, hey, we want you to make the most informed decision you can. And the best way to do that is to let you look around, take it for a test drive. And so, yeah, that's another opportunity. And I do encourage you to do it, because there's not really a downside. You can, you can literally do the very first unit in its entirety, just to say, what does this feel like, start to finish? What does it feel like studying one unit in Becker's program?
In the audit section on the Becker software, there's a link that says course updates. Are those automatically updated on the ebook, or we have to study them separately?
It's a good question. One of the things that we realize is that, and we're getting faster at this, but the minute we identify something, and this could be as mundane as there's a minor error in a question, right? We've got 7,000 multiple choice and hundreds of simulations. Sometimes something slips through and a student catches it, says, hey, I think this is incorrect, and we check it. Sometimes it's also where maybe something could just be more clear. We recognize that we could wait to update our textbooks and the like, but that can't be done overnight, right? So what we do is we say, let's go ahead and update a living PDF document so that way, if there are any pending updates, you have access to them. So yeah, what I recommend to students is, do you need to be looking at it every day? No. I think what's important is as you get close to your exam date, maybe within a week or two, that's where I'd pull down the document and just review it and see, is there anything critical that's pending as an update? These are typically not long documents. More often than not, there might be a page or two that covers any sort of technical updates or the like. But yeah, I think it's worth kind of checking it periodically, but not much more than that. And I think, to be blunt, as we're getting faster and we're improving the back end of our course, which is what allows us to kind of manifest content, I hope we get to a point where we don't even need that anymore, but it's better to have it and not use it very often if we don't need to, but have it just the same if there is something we want to get out in front of our students as soon as possible.
As Becker is moving towards digital platform, is there any possibility to introduce ebooks for the study material sometime soon?
So yeah, so we do have what we call currently the interactive ebook that's built into the course. It's unique to our platform, but it's there. So yes, as it stands today, the only physical piece of our course is the textbook. And although we certainly have looked at ebooks, one of the interesting pieces of feedback we've gotten from a lot of students is, I don't want an ebook, I want my printed book. We kind of believe we should give you both. So that's why you get both. But yeah, so there is the interactive ebook. In fact, as you watch Becker lectures, you're actually watching them in the ebook. So that's one way. We will probably continue to evolve that. We know that some folks have said it'd been nicer if it was in a format that might work with other readers and the like. So we're exploring some of that, but at least it is there. You can today do with nothing physical, right? So you could say, I don't want the book. I don't want to use the physical book. Okay. You can work from the ebook exclusively, and it's annotatable. So if you go in there, you can make notes, you can add your own highlights. Those are saved for you. No one else sees those, they're just for you. So you can work in, and I've seen that. It hasn't been widely adopted, but when I've taught live classes, what I tend to find is that maybe 90% of the room brings books, but 10% or so brings their laptops, and that's what they're doing. They're using the ebook and they're making notes in there. I think it's, I'm a big believer in whatever works for you. If you find one works better than the other, do that. And that's why we do offer both.
Thank you, sir. Going by what you said, I assume there are hundreds of students who pass the exams every year, and I believe it's just the start. What becomes more difficult is to land a proper job. Does Becker play any role in helping its students get placed in companies?
I think the best way to answer that. Somewhat. So here's why I say that. Because a lot of companies trust us with their preparation, right? So a lot of companies out there, now this is why I'm kind of going to get roundabout to your actual question. If you get hired, a lot of them pay for Becker. Okay, so what does that say? Well, it says employers, number one, value the credential, or they wouldn't be willing to invest in their people. And two, they trust Becker. Okay, so what if you don't have the job yet? Well, at least what you can take, number one, is they value the credential. So yeah, if you've already sat for the exam, if you've passed parts, even if you're not licensed yet, that is something you can put on your resume. And believe me, employers will take note of it. It becomes a distinguishing factor. So in that way, we help, because helping you achieve your CPA, or at least getting through the exam, does basically raises your stock value with potential employers. Have there been instances where we have had a candidate that has wanted to make contact, or where an employer has reached out to us and said, do you know anyone? That's rare. I can't say it hasn't happened. It's not that common. What I will say, though, at least in India, and I hope I'm not setting Sripal here, but I know that's one thing they pride themselves on is placement, and helping their folks to achieve that placement. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I hear from US students, and I think it's equally true for you guys, is a student who says, Mike, I didn't go to the best college. I didn't, you know, I went to a local university. We're not recruited by the big firms. It's tough. But the great equalizer is the CPA, right? It's kind of what I have found over the years is that those three letters go after your name, which means they're at the top of your resume. It kind of overrides everything else, right? Because if people see those three letters, they immediately know, oh, you passed the exam. Well, that clearly establishes you know your stuff. And a lot of the other ingredients, at least on the educational side, become less critical because that is established. Basically, you now said, hey, I'm on the level with anybody else who says they're a CPA, and frankly, probably above anyone else who isn't. That I think is the indirect impact Becker and Simandhar can have, is that by improving your resume, by enhancing your stock, it makes you more hireable than you would be otherwise.
Can we download Becker ebooks?
You can't, but as I said, you can if you're using our mobile apps, yeah, because then you can download the files so you can review what we call the IEB for short, the interactive ebook. You can't download them as a PDF, to be blunt. We've sometimes seen, we used to do some PDFs and then they started showing up on Craigslist and folks were starting to violate and sell them online. So we're pretty protective, and that's part of why we don't allow as much of that as you might otherwise think we should. But yeah, you can at least, can you work with them offline? You can with the mobile apps.
Okay. Does Becker have any plan to introduce audio notes?
Maybe. So yeah, it's I think there's two ways to answer that. One is, are we constantly challenging the way we teach? Absolutely, yes. In fact, I can tell you in the past 9 months, especially, how many lengthy discussions we've had about the way we deliver our course. And that includes everything, right? Should lectures be the most prominent part? Are we teaching those lectures in the best way possible? And so forth. So I think that's all, anything and everything is up for grabs. We have actually heard a couple of flavors on this. One is to offer kind of a straight playable audio file, right? So basically, if you want to, you know, we hear from candidates, and I remember some of the traffic where you say, hey, it'd be nice if I could, like, you know, have my phone playing the audio lecture while I'm sitting in the car in traffic. So yeah, that's something we're definitely looking at, is how to make that work a little bit better. And I would say, as far as kind of notes or additions, understand that's part of our lecture. Our lecture style is meant to say, hey, here's the text. We're then going to weave in some additional commentary, example, mnemonic, memory device, what have you. So I kind of feel like the way we teach is kind of this annotation style. But yeah, and I also feel like that's what the Skillmaster videos are, is kind of a, hey, here's some additional notes and some additional thoughts to help you with a particular question. So yeah, I think you'll find that to be true in a number of our course elements, but we are also looking at how to enhance the audio side as we go forward.
How true is the Becker bump? What's the real Becker bump from the simulated exams?
If you can figure that one out, we'd love to hear. We've actually been doing, believe it or not, we actually had Santa trying to help us with this, is to see if there was a statistical link, right? It's one thing to say, and I know what you're talking about, you can go online to forums and you hear about students and they report, right? They'll say, I got this on my simulated exam, I got this on my real exam, see? Unfortunately, that's not the kind of thing we can claim, because it has to be statistically valid, and that's not. So I can't tell you what the bump is. I can tell you with the, you know, so that I don't get in trouble, say anecdotally, do people say that our simulated exams are more challenging? Yes. In general, does the data bear that out? I would say in general, it does. Exactly how big is it? Is it different from one part to another? We truthfully, we cannot say with statistical validity. What I will say is, I think the very fact you take a simulated exam benefits you, right? Because it is the one place in the entire course where you can truly take, you know, comprehensively look at everything that's within the scope of one section of the exam under those conditions. I also think, and I mentioned this, I think part of why, so there's a couple reasons you could say there's a bump. One is it's harder, so it pushes you. I think the other is the other most important skill. In fact, if you said, Mike, what is the most important skill not related to content knowledge on the exam? I said, that's easy. Time management, period. Hands down. Being able to efficiently manage your 4 hours is critical. And again, the simulated exam, just by going through this experience, helps you really kind of solidify in your mind, okay, am I moving fast enough through the exam to get through everything and make the most of my 4 hours? And I think that is if there's a reason why there should be a bump, that's a big one in my mind, is the kind of real life practice this provides is part of why it has, you know. Now, do I consider it a good thing if people say, wow, I felt like your simulated exams were harder? Yeah, I do. I hope so. I hope that's exactly how you feel. And it does make you a little sharper on exam day. But yeah, we've been looking at that. Believe me, our marketing department would love to be able to say, statistics show that people who do this simulated exam score this many points higher. For now, that remains an anecdotal claim. It's worse than, I guess it's better than nothing, but yeah, it's not something we can give you a statistically sound, here's what it is.
Let's say if I got 80% in Becker's test, so can I assume myself to be ready for CPA exam, or do I need to work hard?
See, there's a, that is a, man, that's a dangerous question, because here's the threat to me, right? I say, yes, absolutely. And then you don't pass. You can come right back to me and go, you lied. Truth be told, yes, we do. And this is where I also defer to those who have the most relevant experience, right? So I would actually defer to Sripal and the Simandhar team to say, they could at least tell you, well, with the Indian candidates we've worked with folks who have come out of your university, we have found that yes, that if they score at least so much, that tends to translate to a passing score. Here's what can be challenging, and this is what makes it intangibly difficult. You could do 3 simulated exams, get 80s on all 3 of them, and still walk into the CPA exam and fail. Why? Maybe just the difference in pressure, right? Maybe you just being at the testing center is uncomfortable enough that it affects your performance. Maybe when you took your practice exams, you were doing it in the evenings, and that was and you were fairly well rested, but your exam is scheduled for the morning and you're jet lagged because you had to travel to take the exam. So that there's so many other things that can disrupt that and can affect that. That's why it's tough for us to say, oh yeah, you get here, you're there, you're good. Now, to be fair, I'm going to come back to our personalized learning. So one of the things this is trying to present to students is proficiency, right? There are 2 ways to measure how you're getting through the Becker course. One is progress, right? Did you watch all this? Did you answer all these questions? And that's important because we want to make sure you're exposed to all the content. But if you were to check all those boxes and not actually absorb it and learn it, it didn't really work, did it? So we got to look at proficiency as well. This is newer. Proficiency is harder to gauge. It's easy to gauge progress. Yep, you did that. Yep, you watched that. Yep, you answered those questions. This is tougher. But what we want to be able to get to in the same way as what you're asking, to say, well, what translates to say I'm ready? One is, as you work through the questions and you drill the questions, these badges, those stars you see fill in, as more stars fill in, the badge changes color from red border to yellow to green. So what we're kind of working towards is, if all the badges are green, that shows you're ready because you are now showing proficiency in all of the content. Now, if you had 1 or 2 badges that were still yellow and you had all greens, are you ready? You probably are still in pretty good shape, but that at least gives you that more holistic view of your proficiency. Yes, we do have as a goal, we'd like to get to a point where we can more accurately and at least statistically make that kind of a claim to say, yes, we believe what you are currently showing us translates to a likelihood of passing the exam. But again, because that is you cannot be wrong saying something like that. You have to be very well back. You have to have a lot of support for doing something like that, and you have to say it exactly the right way. but yeah, I understand why you want it. We do too. We would like to get there. I think we will, but we're going to be very deliberate to make sure we do it the right way.
Okay, Aishwarya, so I'll just take it up because there are so many questions and all. I think one last question, Mike, because so many of them are asking. So I'll just take up one last question.
Sure.
Just a second. Let's say if I get 80% in Becker test, so can I assume myself ready for the CPA exam, or do I need to do hard work? Is what is
you know, I believe, I think an 80 is not a bad benchmark. I'll say that. You know, I'm a believer that even if you show an 80, if you're taking, you know, if you get that and you're 3 or 4 days away from your exam, then I might say, hey, you know what, other than maybe going through some flashcards or, you know, kind of reviewing some key concepts is good. What I will say is this: don't just take it as, oh, I got this number, I'm done studying. Even when you get an 80, that should still indicate you have areas of content weakness, something. If you want to do more hard work, as the question was put, focus on those areas, right? Focus on shoring up those remaining weak spots. In fact, that's what I tell candidates all the time is I say, hey, you know, because they ask a version of the question you're asking, which is, how should I spend those last days before I sit for the exam? And I say, well, simulated exams are part of it. Getting those scores are part of it, but also diagnosing where are your weaker areas, because then you know, okay, in the time I have left on the clock before I take my exam, I want to focus in not on everything. I'm going to focus in on these specific areas, doing some additional work. Go back, maybe watch some very specific lecture segments, do more practice questions again, whatever it may be. Because you know, what that's telling you is if you have proficiency and if the simulated exam says, yes, you know this content, great. Don't worry about that then. That's a pretty good piece of your foundation. Worry about shoring up what still may be weak. But yeah, I think that what's interesting, don't take it to be, again, that bump can be there. And I'll give you one last anecdote, and then Sripal, I'll turn it over to you, and I will go see what's happening. I feel like I've heard a couple of my very small coworkers trying to come in here, so I'm going to go check on them. But we had a student in Dallas, Texas, that was had passed 3 parts of the exam and was in position to be a Watt-Cells winner. I think she had gotten 96s or 97s on all 3 of those parts. So she now had made that her goal. She was like, I'm going to get it. I'm going to be a Watt-Cells winner. And so she turned all of her attention to that 4th and final exam. And she took a simulated exam, and I think she scored on her simulated exam about a 64 and panicked. You can understand that, right? You're like, I want to get a Watt-Cells. I think I'm well prepared. You take this exam and get 64. And she did. She was incredibly upset and talked to her instructors and everything else. She won the Watt-Cells award, or at least she got a 90-some score. So in the same way, I can't say, oh, yeah, you got an 80, you're good to go. I can't say if you get a 65, you're not good to go. Because we've had, as I said, that's where that Becker bump, as it's anecdotally been presented, has come into play. So the simulated exam, at the end of the day, it's like a barometer for telling the weather. Is it accurate? More often than not. Does it mean it's precise? No, right? If the barometer says, wow, the pressure is low, does that automatically mean it's raining outside? No. Is it more probable it's raining? Yeah. And that's kind of what the simulated exams, it's one more data point helping to build the case, are you ready? But it doesn't stand just by itself, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, looks cool. Thank you, Mike. Thanks a lot. I know there are still so many questions. So before I talk on anything on evaluation, so last 20 minutes, I'll be just taking up questions and answers for the evaluation front, right? Rather than talking on the process, because we are already late. And thank you so much, Mike.
My pleasure.
Still, there are so many questions on final review and the original Becker, because there are 5 times someone have asked that. Is there a difference between the final review Becker product and the original content, or should we buy both? And
Yeah, so final review, it's a good question. And it's one we've been struggling with because we're looking at, in fact, I'll tell you this, that are on our roadmap is an overhaul of our final review product. Not that it's bad. Our students love it, and I'll explain why. But one of the things I don't like about it, bluntly, is I do like our course being online. I like it being cloud-based. I like it being multi-platform. Final review is not. It's desktop still, so it's a little outdated in that way. So we're looking at how to bring it online too, which will be a good change when it's done. But what purpose does it serve? Well, here's the thing. It serves two different groups. So if you find yourself feeling you're one of these, then final review may be the fit for you. Okay, number one is it's where you say, I want more practice. Because the multiple choice and simulations in final review are different. They are not in the main course. So if you are, one of those that's like, I can't get enough questions to practice with, final review is a good fit. It has additional lecture content that is meant to kind of, in a rapid fire way, recap key concepts from the entire scope. So think of it this way. Financial has 10 units. That's roughly 40 hours of lecture content. If you watch the corresponding final review lecture, you can watch all of financial in about maybe 9 hours. So it doesn't hit on everything. It's just meant to recap. So if you find that beneficial, again, it's like quite literally a final review. That's one audience, is the one going in who says, this part worries me. I want something extra. I want more practice. I want more questions. And you can do that for one part or multiple parts. The other group that has told us they like it is those that fail, but just barely. So they say, Mike, I got a 73. I'm close. I don't want to go back through the main course again. What should I do? And I say, well, final review is a good place to go because it helps you kind of, again, that high level video, the lecture recap is beneficial, and revisiting concepts, but seeing new questions you haven't, because some folks say, if I work questions enough times, I feel like I've memorized them and I'm not really answering them anymore. So that's the other groups. They'll buy final review after the fact if they want to basically said, I'm close, I need something to help me kind of get over the hump to pass. So that's been the intent. We're looking at what else we can do. As I said, we're willing to challenge every bit of our teaching methodology, and that includes exactly what should be in final review and how it should be presented. So stay tuned. That's on our roadmap because we want to enhance it. And we're always looking for other things we can add to add value to the course and to add value to our students. So, we're never satisfied ever with what our course is. We are always challenging what can we do to make it better. So you too can be a beneficiary of that part of our passion.
Yep. Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks a lot. I think it's been like almost 1.5 hours for sure. It's a continuous talk. I know you didn't even add water also. Just seeing the video actually. Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks a lot. So guys,
it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So I'll sign off now. Thank you so much for your attention, folks. Appreciate all the great questions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Pleasure to be with you virtually. That seems to be how we're all interacting, but it is, even if it is just virtual, a pleasure to be back with you guys once again in India. So I'll sign off there. Thanks so much. Take care.
thank you.